Hello, this is Yogeshwar 7000 again, and I'm back with another interesting topic on Vedic astrology today. And today we'll be talking about something different, which is that we look at our charts and we know that we have certain very well placed planets in our chart, but how come they're not giving us the results? And sometimes we do get confused. So today's discussion will cover that on certain cases and certain situations. And of course, you cannot discuss all the situations in this little video, but there is a certain kind of a situation where you do not get the good results of planets, even if they are well placed in your chart, and you tend to get confused, and then you go from one astrologer to another astrologer and you cannot figure out what's going on. And that's what happens in such a situation. So we'll discuss one such situation once again, not all of them, when positive planets in your birth chart are actually becoming neutral or even negative for you, and you don't know what's going on. So first, understand something which is related to Karakas. Okay, so we know that there are 12 houses, 12 zodiac signs in a birth chart as per Vedic astrology, and each of those houses, okay, not the zodiac sign, each of those houses starting from the first house to the 12th house have certain Karakas, okay, as far as planets are concerned. So Karakas is a Sanskrit word for significator. So in other words, the first house will have a significator in terms of a planet. The second house will have a significator in terms of a planet. We're not talking about significations which are related to those areas of our lives. No, we're talking about every house has been given a significator in terms of a planet. So first house has been given a significator in terms of a planet. The second house has been given a significator in terms of a planet. The third house has been given a significator or a Karaka in terms of a planet, and that goes until all the 12 houses. Okay, now of course we know that those houses have significations in terms of the areas of our lives, and we are not discussing that. Okay, we're discussing what planets are significators of those houses. Okay, and this is coming directly from the ancient scriptures. This is not a figment of my imagination or some recent astrologer's imagination. So of course, people who are astrologers and watching this video would understand this slightly better, I'm sure. So as per the ancient scriptures, the sun is the significator of the first house, or the lagna, or the ascendant. Okay, the planet Jupiter is the significator of the second house. Okay, the planet Mars is the significator of the third house. The planet Moon and Mercury are both significators of the fourth house. The planet Jupiter, once again, is a significator of the fifth house, just like it's a significator of the second house. And of course, once these planets become significators of these houses, they get related to the significations of those houses as well, which means that we know that the second house represents family and wealth. We know that the fourth house represents mother and vehicles and happiness in general. We know the first house represents health. So of course, if we're talking about these planets as significators, obviously they are connected to the significations of the house as well, but we're not going into details of what the significations of the houses are. Once again, we're just going into the signification of those houses with respect to the planets, and of course the planets are connected with the signification of those houses, like I just explained. So once again, the sun is the significator of the first house, Jupiter is significator of the second house, Mars is the significator of the third house, Moon and Mercury are the significator of the fourth house. Jupiter is, once again, along with the second house, it's a significator of the fifth house as well. Saturn and Mars both are significators of the sixth house. Venus is the significator of the seventh house. Saturn is the significator of the eighth house. Just like it's a significator of the sixth house, it's also a significator of the eighth house. And of course, once we say a significator of the eighth house, obviously, it gets related to the significations of the eighth house. And what's the signification of the eighth house? It is longevity and of course other matters. The ninth house significator is Sun and Jupiter. So Sun, along with being a significator of the first house, it's a significator of the ninth house as well. Jupiter, along with being a significator of the second house, the fifth house, it is also a significator of the ninth house as well. So the ninth house has two significators, Sun and Jupiter. Then again, if you go to the 10th house, Jupiter is again a significator of the 10th house. So Jupiter is a significator of the second house, Jupiter is a significator of the fifth house, Jupiter is the significator of the ninth house, and Jupiter is also a significator of the 10th house. And that explains why Jupiter is so important in our lives. When it gives, it can give, a lot in terms of, giving you wealth and family, which is ruled by the second house. It can give you children, progeny, happiness, pleasures, which is related to the fifth house, intelligence also. It can give you the significations related to the ninth house, which is of course higher intelligence, pilgrimages, gurus, knowledge of the Vedas, religion, so on and so forth. And it's also a significator of the 10th house here, what you see, which means that it can give you so much in terms of these houses. That's why Jupiter is considered to be a very expansive planet, and it can give you pretty much, if it's well placed, can give you pretty much a lot in all these areas. Anyway, so Jupiter again is a significator of the 10th house, along with the second, the fifth, and the ninth house, along with Sun. Now Sun again is a significator of the first house we discussed. Sun also is a significator of the ninth house we discussed, and Sun is also a significator of the 10th house as well. So again, just like Jupiter, maybe slightly lesser than Jupiter, Sun has a very important role in our lives because it rules over, in terms of signification, the first house, the ninth house, and here the 10th house as well. So it's at par with Jupiter in terms of giving. And of course, if it's not well placed, of course it can take whatever is related to Sun in terms of its significations and what it rules over. Mercury once again is a significator of the 10th house, just like the 4th house. And Saturn again is a significator of the 10th house, just like it is a significator of the 6th house. It is also a significator of the 8th house, and it is also a significator of the 10th house once again. Jupiter is a significator of the 11th house. And try to think of this. Jupiter is a significator of the 2nd house, the 5th house, the 9th house, the 10th house, and the 11th house. Wow, isn't that interesting? And then Saturn is the significator of the 12th house, and of course all things related to the 12th house, which is, what is the 12th house about? Well, it's about meditation, it's about intuition, it's about giving, it's about even moksha. So we'll not get into that, the significations of the house. We're just talking about the planets today. What houses they signify, and what are the significations of these planets as far as the houses are concerned, as given to us by the ancient sages. Now, once again, going to the discussion on why do planets not give us the good results which we expect from them, because they are well placed. Jupiter may be very well placed in your birth chart. Why is it not giving the good result? Jupiter may be placed in the 2nd house or the 5th house, which it signifies. It may be placed in the 9th house, which it signifies, and it may be placed in the 10th house, which it signifies. It may be placed in the 11th house, which it signifies. Why is it Jupiter not giving us good results? That's a question. That's a confusion. That's a mystery which comes to our mind. And similarly with other planets, which we just discussed about the significations. So the reason why a planet does not give good results and sometimes turn into negative results is because of a concept called Karako Bhavanashaye. Okay, that's a Sanskrit little phrase here, which is used extensively by astrological texts and Vedic astrology scholars over hundreds of years, thousands of years maybe, and this is why you do not get the good results what you expect for. Once again, it's called Karako Bhavanashaya, meaning which we've discussed the planets which are the Karakas for these 12 houses, and it is said in ancient scriptures that if a Karaka or a significator of the house sits in the same house, it destroys that house. Okay, that is the reason why you're not getting good results in spite of the fact that they are placed so well. So for example, Jupiter in the 2nd house, and Jupiter signifies the 2nd house, it is going to destroy that house according to the ancient scriptures. Jupiter is a Karaka or the significator of the 5th house, it is going to destroy the 5th house as per this concept of Karako Bhavanashaya, which is a significator. If it sits in the same house which it signifies, it destroys that house. Similarly, Moon is a significator of the 4th house and all the significations related to the 4th house. So Moon is going to destroy that 4th house. So that is a very important concept which you remember, and whenever you see that, there is a flag, red flag right there. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that all the time these Karakas or the significators, if they sit in the houses which they signify, are going to give bad results. In specific terms, the shlokas say that Venus, Mercury and Jupiter, if they occupy the houses which they signify, and not all houses, they have also specified which houses which they signify, then they are harmful to the horoscope. Okay, so for Venus, it has been also, well, Venus signifies only the 7th house. So they very clearly mentioned Venus, if it is sitting in the 7th house, will destroy that house much more intensely as compared to other planets sitting in their houses of significations. So these are really, really red flag areas, and that's coming directly from the ancient scriptures. Similarly, Mercury, if it's sitting in the 4th house, which it signifies, and it's going to destroy that house. Now, Mercury is also a significator of the 10th house, but they have not mentioned that Mercury will destroy the 10th house as intensely as what it will do to the 4th house. So whenever you see Venus in the 7th house, red flag. Whenever you see Mercury in the 4th house, red flag. And they've also mentioned that Jupiter in the 5th house from the Lagna, if it's sitting in the house, the 5th house, which it signifies, then it's bad for the chart, and anything related to the significations of the 5th house, which we know that what 5th house represents or signifies, it is really harmful. Now, they have not said, the ancient scriptures are not saying that it is going to harm that house, the other houses which it signifies, that intensely. Like the 2nd house, it won't affect it that much. Like the 10th house, it's not going to affect that much. Okay, like the 11th house, if Jupiter is sitting in the 11th house or the 10th house or the 2nd house, it's not, or the or the ninth house, it's not going to affect it that much intensely or severely is the better word. Rather, it won't affect it as severely as it would affect the fifth house. So these three planets have been given special importance in destroying the houses which they signify: Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter, and only in relation to the Venus with 7th house, Mercury with 4th house, and Jupiter with the 5th house. Now again, having said that, we have seen what the ancient scriptures say. So what you would have seen birth charts where Venus is placed in the 7th house. So according to the scriptures, the person should never get married because it's destroying the house of marriage, because 7th house is the house of marriage. But that's not the case. We've seen certain cases where, you know, a person has been married very happily. Similarly, in the 4th house, Mercury, it's supposed to destroy that house, 4th house, but we've seen that Mercury does not destroy that house completely. You've seen certain cases where you know, Mercury has not destroyed the 4th house, and the 4th house is about you know, the mother, vehicles, and peace of mind, basic education, nourishment, all these areas. They've not been destroyed as much. And the 5th house, there's lots of cases which astrologers would have seen that it's supposed to destroy the 5th house of children, progeny, happiness, but it's not. Jupiter in the 6th house has given them progeny and children and happiness from the 5th house. Then again, we try to think, why do you think the ancient scriptures are not correct? Why is this happening? I mean, that's what's been mentioned, that they're supposed to affect these houses very severely, but they have not done that. So again, you know, we understand that this has happened because so many other factors also have to be taken into consideration. This is not the only factor. You know, you have to look at from other angles. You have to look what aspects they have. You have to look at what degrees, what conjunctions, and of course look at, you know, basic Karaka principle given to us by the ancient sages, Gemini. So just don't jump to a conclusion. This is, astrology is basically gives us an indication. It does not come to a conclusive or a conclusion based on just one principle or just one shloka. So be very careful in analyzing birth charts. Analyze it from all angles and then come to a final conclusion. Don't come to a final conclusion by just considering one factor. So that was one thing. The other factor is that if the significator sits in the house of its signification, it does not kind of destroy it completely or severely affect it. Okay, it just means, if you try to think of it, it's just putting in too much of that planet into it, which is it's like considering, okay, well, if you put too much sweet into an already sweet thing, you know, it kind of turns to be bitter. It's just too much sweet. Too much of that signification in that house which it signifies kind of destroys it. It spoils the fun. Try to think of it. If you have a chocolate which is already sweet and you dip it in another syrup of sugar and then eat it, the sweetness kind of gets disturbed and it spoils the sweetness. And sometimes if it's too much sweet, it turns to be kind of a bitter flavor as well. So that's the idea behind this. So moving into trying to understand these houses, if Jupiter, who is a significator of the second house, sits in the second house of wealth and happiness and family, it will make it too much of Jupiter, too much of wealth, too much of happiness, too much of family, and it kind of, because of too much of it, it kind of turns into spoiling the show. Okay. Similarly, Mars sitting in the third house of younger siblings, too much of it, because Mars signifies younger siblings, and it's sitting in the third house of younger siblings. It's too much of it, and it's kind of, because of it too much, it kind of destroys it. Similarly, other planets which we discussed, fifth house, Jupiter, if it sits in the fifth house, too much of it, it kind of spoils it, it kind of destroys it. because it's too much of that expansion and progeny and happiness from children. Okay, Venus, try to think of Venus sitting in the 7th house. Too much of Venus sitting, too much of, you know, getting sexual gratification, too much of expectations of, you know, companionship, passion, sexual gratification. That is too much, and that starts to spoil it. So that's the whole idea behind why Karako Bhava Nashai occurs. And of course, go back and see this too much happens more so in the case of Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter. Venus for the 7th house, Mercury for the 4th house, and Jupiter for the 5th house. But like I said, there have been cases where people have been married very well off when Venus is in the 7th house. But what happens is that over the years, as the marriage continues, that too much spoils it. So don't come to a conclusion that if Venus is sitting in the 7th house, no marriage is going to occur. Of course, look at it from other principles as well, not just this principle. And then also try to understand that this too much of it is going to spoil it slowly and gradually. And of course, there are remedial measures, and if there are no remedial Vedic measures, you can, you know, try to deal with it in a practical sense, that try to withdraw too much of sensuality in that marriage, try to withdraw too much of companionship and sensuality and sexual activity in that marriage. So that's how you can change it. Similarly, if Mercury is sitting in the 4th house, and 4th house signifies all these areas which we already discussed, then withdraw yourself from, you know, don't be, you know, try to be always getting into, say for example, if it's vehicles, you know, don't get too much of vehicles. If it's mother, don't, you know, I mean, of course, you should care for your mother, but something too much is happening there. And that's why over the years, you will feel that too much. Venus, 7th house, too much especially. And of course, all the Karakas, I'm just saying that these 3 have been described. Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter for the 7th, 4th, and the 5th have been described to be affecting it more severely. But other Karakas also do affect. So be very careful about it, at least these 3. Like Jupiter, it's not that you won't have children. If Jupiter is sitting in the 5th house, you will. It's not that you'll not have happiness from children, but then your expectations are going to go higher and higher and higher, because it's too much of it, too much involvement with children, too much expectations from children, too much of intelligence, too much of going after intelligence, too much of pleasures, too much of desires in terms of pleasures, whatever the significations are, the too much. So it's going to happen, but then, you know, your relations, if that's too much of it, similar, I mean, if you look at Venus, if it's too much of it, your relation with the spouse gets severed over time if you cannot handle that too much of the Venus in the sitting in the 7th house. Similarly, if Jupiter is sitting in the 5th house, then your relationship with your children, or, you know, you in relationship with their children and children in relationship with you, either ways, that too much is going to spoil the show. So be very careful, and not just these 3, all the other planets which we discussed in terms of the signification. So Karako Bhava Nashai happens. It is true, and I've seen that. But don't think that it severely destroys the house so much that it won't give you those significations which are related to that house. It's just going to be, if you do not control that too much, that's going to spoil the show slowly and gradually. And you can be you have to be very careful of that, and you can take care of it if you understand your birth chart well. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this video, and in the meanwhile, I will recommend subscribe to my channel and check out my website. There is a link below, and I will see you with an interesting topic on Vedic astrology very soon. Goodbye.